Good morning, Mr. McEwan. Will you raise your right hand and say the words of the oath after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
You are Gary McEwan.
I am.
What age are you?
I am 52.
You retired from Police Scotland on the 15th of April 2021.
That's correct.
And what was your rank when you retired?
I was a national policing commander at that time.
And can you give us a little bit of an idea of what that involved?
So there was a number of local policing divisions across Police Scotland, as well as a number of national divisions. There were fewer national divisions as there were local policing divisions, and I was the national policing commander when I retired for Criminal Justice Services Division, which had responsibility for custody being one, as well as other sort of operational and non-operational roles across Scotland.
Thank you. How many years service did you have when you retired?
31 years.
And when you were involved with the death of Mr. Bio, that was in May 2015, as you'll know. What was your rank at that time?
So I was a Chief Superintendent Local Policing Commander. So when Police Scotland was created in April 2013, they separated the country into a number of policing divisions, and Fife was a single policing division, and they appointed local policing commanders, and I was lucky enough to be appointed the commander of Fife.
So were you the Chief Super and the commander of the whole of the Fife region?
Yes, so pre-Police Scotland, Fife was a constabulary, it was a police force in its own right. So in, I think it was October 2012, they began the transition from a single police organisation in Fife Constabulary towards the single service for Scotland.
And that would have obviously included the Kirkcaldy area.
Yes. And
can you explain to people listening the type of what your role involved at that time in May 2015?
Yeah, so as the local policing commander, Fife was not unique but unusual insofar as it was coterminous with the local authority. So it was a single Fife council and a single Fife police division. So the police and the partners were very closely aligned together. So my role as policing commander was to take oversight of policing in Fife, serious crime, disorder, take responsibility for the staff, the police officers and the police staff across Fife, as well as I seen it certainly as trying to build and relationships with local communities across the whole of Fife. Additional to that, it was then one of the benefits of a national service was that then had the opportunity to learn from other policing commanders that were located in other areas across Scotland. So we had a forum there that we could all engage with one another and cascade best practice across our different policing divisions.
What was the name of that forum?
The Police Commanders Forum. Right. So it sat every 4 weeks, I think it was, chaired by the Chief Constable or the Deputy Chief Constable, and that was an opportunity for probably 15, 16 of us, including the Chief Constable and the Deputy, just to sit and talk about best practice and share good practice and identify areas in which we can improve.
I was going to ask you how many commanders there were at that time. Was that?
I think there was 13 from memory. They have changed it slightly since then, but I think it started off as 13.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at a blue folder you have in front of you? I know that you've watched a little bit of the evidence of the inquiry. We'll come on to that. You will know that we try and provide all of the people coming to give evidence with hard copies of documents that we think might assist them when they're giving evidence. Now, as you'll have seen, things come up on the screen in front of you. So when I'm referring to, say, a statement and a paragraph, it'll be on the screen so everyone in the room can see it. But if at any time you remember something or you need to refer to the document, please feel free to use them at any stage. They're for your use.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to go through a number of statements that you've given since 2015, and we'll just check that we've got everything that we need. The first thing in your folder should be PS 03136.
That's correct.
And we'll put that on the screen so everyone can see it. And was this a operational statement effectively? We've
Yes.
heard of these, right?
Yes.
So it seems to be on a sort of pro forma style, but it's still a statement that you prepared yourself,
I
is
did,
it?
yes.
Can you tell us when you prepared this?
So
I don't see any dates on it. We can scroll down to the bottom of the first page.
I think from memory there was a date maybe on the original, but from memory it was about June into July of 2015.
Okay. Now, if I tell you that the next statement in your folder is PERC 00181, is dated 24th of June 2015, and as I understand it, we'll come on to that, as I understand it, this was a statement that you gave to PERC.
Yeah.
If we can just scroll down this page, you'll see it was given in Randallfield Police Office, Stirling, 24th of June 2015, 10:05 in the morning. And I think in the body of this statement, it says you'd previously
Yeah.
given another statement to PERC.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So the first statement will have predated the statement of the 24th of June.
Right. So the one that's on the screen at the moment, PERC 00181, says, I've already provided a statement to PERC, and that'd be prior to the date you were speaking to them on the 24th of June. And that prior statement would be the one we looked at first.
Yes.
Which is PS 03136.
Yes.
All right, thank you. So that would have been prepared at some point between the 3rd of May 2015 and you going to speak to PERC on the 24th of June 2015.
Yes.
So in that sort of time scale. In relation to the first statement that you wrote yourself, were you doing your best to give a true and accurate account of your involvement with the events on the 3rd of May?
Yes, absolutely.
And then can that also be said of the second statement that we've just looked at, the one you gave to PERC on the 24th of June? Were you doing your best to give PERC an accurate account and a true account of what you'd been involved in?
Yes. They were more in response to direct questions, so they were more focused, but yeah, they were absolutely truthful.
So
My
the first
recollection.
statement was really your recollection, unprompted, and the second statement that you gave to PERC was more in response to questions.
That's correct.
And then can we look at a third statement, PERC 00182, and that should also be in your folder. And this is a statement that was taken on the 23rd of January 2018. And that was given to Investigator Gary Sinclair at Stirling Police Station in the presence of Investigator Ross Sinclair.
That's correct.
There again from PERC.
Yes.
Can you, when you gave this statement, can you explain why it was effectively 3 years after the events?
Really, what PERC explained to me was that there was just further information. I am assuming that it was because, they'd had a chance to triangulate with other statements, so there was maybe just more additional information that they were looking for from me, and that was the basis of this statement.
Thank you. And again, were you doing your best, although it was 3 years later, were you doing your best to give an accurate and true account
I
of
certainly was, yeah.
your recollection?
Yeah.
Now, I think in your inquiry statement, which we'll come to in a moment, at paragraph 8, you say that you were doing your best to give a true and accurate account, but your memory was better in 2015 than it was in 2018.
Yeah.
And can the same be said today?
Yeah, I mean, that's the truth of the matter is, yeah, it was fresher in my mind. The original statement compared to the final statement is more detailed because of the type of questioning I was given, but yeah, they all in principle were absolutely based on truth in the best of my recollection.
Thank you. Now, just so that everyone knows, you didn't use a notebook in 2015. That wasn't your practice. Is that correct?
I did have a notebook, but
Oh.
I only used I used a notebook at that time, just with the sort of the rank that was it for misconduct investigations that I would be leading on. So I didn't use it as a matter of routine, but I used it for sensitive inquiries.
Right. But that didn't include this inquiry.
No.
And you've not had any access, because they're not available, to any day books that you may have used?
No, I did have a day book that I would use, but I didn't use that for this inquiry because I wasn't at my desk
Right.
when this one, through this was at Kirkcaldy, so I never put any entries in my day book.
All right, thank you. Can we now look at your first contact with this inquiry, SBPI 00075? So they're called Rule 8 requests that come from the inquiry, which are a series of questions, and then you're allowed to read through that and respond in writing, and they're called responses to Rule 8 requests. Effectively, this would be your first statement to this inquiry, detailing
That's correct.
specific questions and answers. And there were 9 questions sent to you. And can we look at the last page, please, of this? It's on the screen. There we are. If we can, it's page 9. If we could go up to, I just want to show the signature. So at the end, we'll start there actually, if we leave it there. You'll see at the bottom of that page it says, "I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website." And you understood that to be the case.
That's correct.
And although we have a redacted version on the screen, you signed that
I did, yes.
on the 28th of June last year.
Yep.
Thank you. And you do understand that this will be published on the website as part of the overall evidence.
I'm happy with that. Yep.
Thank you. Great. And then if we could look at your inquiry statement, this is the second time you've been in contact with us. That was SBPI 00258. And you'll see your name at the top. It was taken by a member of the inquiry team on the Tuesday, the 13th of December last year. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look at, it's 46 pages and 201 paragraphs. And if we look at the last page, again, you will see that you've signed the last page and all the preceding pages. Thank you. It's redacted on our screen, so it's at paragraph 201. There we are. And it says again, "I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website." Signed by you, I think on the 3rd of February this year.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know that you've told us that you've listened to some of the evidence in the inquiry.
Yeah, not a lot to be honest with you, but a couple of the relevant witnesses to me, yes.
And I think in your inquiry statement you make reference to having listened to some of the evidence of Joanne Caffrey, one of the experts, is that right?
Yes.
And to having watched the evidence of Caddy Johnson.
Yes.
And then I think you've also made reference to reading some of the statements from the Johnson family.
Yes.
And as a core participant, you have access, and your lawyers have access to various statements that have been disclosed.
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Well, I'd like to turn to the 3rd of May 2015 and ask you some questions. As I'm going through these, I might put part of a statement up on the screen so you can refer to it, and I'll be able to ask you more questions about the detail.
Okay.
So you've told us in your inquiry statement you were a local policing commander at the time in May 2015, and you've briefly touched on that role, but can you tell us what your responsibility was in relation to, say, the area of Kirkcaldy and what involvement you had in that area?
So the command structure in Fife was the local commander, and as I say, I would be responsible for a great deal of partnership working, but also for delivery of the policing plan for the area that I was in charge of, and then supporting me in doing that were 3 deputies, and those deputies were responsible for operations, for people and for CID, and they would, form part of my command team. Fife, for those that know the area, is, as I say, it's the third biggest local authority. It's quite a big area, and quite a well populated. And there's various towns within Fife, and Kirkcaldy is one of those towns. The structure that would underpin my deputies were a local area commander that would take charge of each of the key towns, so Kirkcaldy, Glenrothes, Dunfermline, St Andrews, and they would then report up through my deputies into me around ongoing matters. I would chair a morning meeting every morning between 9 and 15:15, where the local area commanders, the chief inspectors from across Fife, my deputies if they were available, and we would hold a meeting either in face or via teleconference, where I would be appraised of ongoing events and situations and crimes and any other important issues that I needed to be aware of, and then take whatever decisions were needed at that point.
Where were you based?
So my main office was in Glenrothes at the main headquarters in Detroit Road, and that was where I would primarily base myself, but myself and my deputies agreed that, at least once a week we would naturally go to one of the other towns and be present at their meetings, and then dial in at that point, just to try and ensure a bit of visibility among staff.
How often were you in Kirkcaldy?
Quite a lot, to be fair. I mean, I was a detective constable, a detective sergeant at Kirkcaldy, a uniform inspector at Kirkcaldy. That was tended to be one of the busiest towns in Fife, so I spent a lot of my career in and around that area.
So you're quite familiar with the location, the place,
Yeah.
and also the officers in Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Not a lot of the younger ones. I would recognise faces, but not know everybody's name. As new recruits started, I would always have a sort of, as they were going through the training, I would meet them, and we'd have a sort of a commander session where it would be me and the staff. But then I wouldn't sort of have that personal contact with them on a daily basis. That would be the responsibility of the sergeants, inspectors, and ultimately the chief inspector.
Right. And all of those that you've named, the ranks, they would be lower than your rank?
Yes. Yeah.
In paragraph 20 of your inquiry statement, if we could go to that. Lovely, thank you. You were asked about the command structure on the 3rd of May in relation to the incident involving Mr. Bio. But you say there, I had responsibility for community impact, staff welfare, and to ensure sufficiency of resource was available to assist with this inquiry, as well as maintaining a proportionate policing response for all other policing matters that were ongoing. Policing business continuity, if you like. I'm quite interested in what you've said here, because we've heard that other officers were also involved with things like welfare for the officers, and I'm interested, was there an overlap between the role you had, or an oversight role, with other officers doing the work on the ground, if I can say?
So, and I think it is in my statement at some point, I mean, we put the structures go in place, and then I wouldn't expect to know and hear about every issue with the staff. I would expect to hear if there was any significant problems with the staff. I would want to know about that, but I wouldn't know, the day-to-day, the example I think I give in my statement is if a member of staff needs a new pair of boots, after this incident, then I wouldn't expect somebody to come to me to ask for my permission. That would just get done. So, I would empower my sergeants and inspectors to make these decisions, and they were all, well experienced and trained to do that.
So when you talk about a significant problem that you would expect to hear about, can you give us an example of what?
In a general sense.
Just in a general sense.
So, trying to sort of not compare it to this incident, but of a similar significance. I'm a member of one of my officers in Methil, so in Leavenmouth, which is another area of Kirkcaldy, Fife, sorry, was very badly assaulted one evening, like very badly assaulted. So I was phoned and told through the night of that significant injury, and then the following day I went out and visited the family, the police officer's family. So it's really significant things I would be expected to be told about.
Right. And you were responsible for community impact. Could you explain what that is?
So again, this is particularly in relation to this inquiry. So for me, one of the really important aspects of this inquiry was the impact that it was going to have on local communities, but as well as national and arguably, worldwide communities. We have seen how incidents such as this can really transform across a nation and can result in significant impact. So I was really keen to get a really close temperature check of how this incident may impact on local as well as national community.
And when you use the word impact, what sort of things are you referring to?
So it could be anything. I mean, impact, it could be a really negative impact. There could, as we've seen, across the world and, across the UK, where, incidents can lead to looting, can lead to disorder, can lead to protest and demonstration. So, you need to understand how a community is feeling about a certain policing action or activity. So it's to try and understand that, and that's where it's important that you have people in the community that can help you pressure test that.
Thank you. Can I ask you about paragraph 24 of your inquiry statement? Now, here you were asked about this section is called Understanding of the Incident, and you say you were sitting in your office in Glenrothes, Police Headquarters, and Chief Inspector Chris Stones gave me a call on the phone. We've heard his name before. I think he was on the phone with Inspector Kay at one point. My recollection is that the briefing was simple. There were multiple calls of a male in possession of a knife. At the point of contact between the police and the male had fallen unconscious and was taken to hospital. Chris was brief, and from the tone in his voice, I could tell it was a bit of a different conversation. I could sense the worry in his voice. I sensed I needed to ask for more detail. I asked the ethnicity of the individual, and he said he was a black man. That detail was important to know because it played a part in my later decision to declare a critical incident. I said I'll jump in the car and head down to Kirkcaldy and ask for a further update as it progressed for the next hour or so. So I'd like to ask you a little bit more about this paragraph. If we can go back up the screen, please. First of all, you say that you could sense the worry in his voice. Had Chief Inspector Stones not volunteered to you at that stage that the male was a black male?
No.
Right. And you actually had to ask him?
So I suppose it's trying to provide a little bit of context. So Chris Stones, he had previously worked for me, so he was a very experienced police officer, but for a period of time before this incident he had been based at the Scottish Police College, and the sort of structure that was in place at that time is that Chris would every probably 8 or 9 weeks would come and work a weekend within Fife to provide on-call coverage. So he was a bit detached from ongoing policing matters because he was doing a really important job at the police college and training. So when I spoke to him that morning, there was absolutely hesitancy in his, because it was a very unusual and clearly became a very traumatic incident for all. So yeah, it was there was definite hesitancy in his voice. He was nervous. He was, yeah.
And that was that prompted you to ask some questions.
Yeah, I just felt there was more there. I just felt I needed to unpick it a little bit. And
What made you ask if the person involved was a black man?
I never asked if he was a black man. I asked what his ethnicity was. And he told me that he was a black man.
Sorry, that was my mistake.
That's okay.
Then. What made you ask about his ethnicity?
Because I just felt there was something, he was just a little bit hesitant, and it was as though it was like just a bit more serious than how it was being portrayed at the time. There was something more to it.
Do you think if it had been a white man involved, he wouldn't have been so hesitant? He wouldn't have sounded that way on the phone to you?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask Chris, to be honest with you. I'm not sure. It was probably because it was two different elements. The fact it was extremely unusual, but the fact also that he wasn't an operational chief inspector. I think it was rightly and understandably quite a big deal for him. It was quite a major investigation.
Right. And you say that detail was important to know because it played a part in my later decision to declare a critical incident. And tell us a little, explain that to us, please.
So, a critical incident, there is a definition. I can't remember it off heart, but I think it's in my statement now. But it's an incident that takes place in the country that has a sort of hugely significant impact on the policing response. And the impact is not on the police, it's on the family, the wider communities, because of the response or the action or inaction that the police have taken. And that is likely, in my view, or could that likely impact on the trust and confidence on policing? And if a police officer feels that that's the case, then they should be, in my view, and as there are probably guidance documents somewhere now, declare that as a critical incident. And the benefit of doing that is it makes it a priority for the whole of the organisation. So, at the minute, or not with it, I'm exaggerating slightly, but with me declaring that a critical incident, the Chief Constable of Police Scotland is aware of that in relatively quick time. This becomes the most important ongoing inquiry within policing on that particular day.
We'll come back to that in more
Okay.
detail, but what time was this call that you had with Chief Inspector Stones?
So I had a couple of calls with Chris. So again, I don't know exactly, probably 7:30. I think it is in one of my previous statements, 7:30, give or take.
And from the time of that call, was that when you realised this was a very important matter, at least from the perspective of possible community impact?
It was certainly on my mind, the fact that the male at that time was still alive. It clearly, and it did get worse, but it could have got worse, and it clearly did. But at that time, that was not the case. So, it was fingers crossed that he would have survived, was the hope.
Right. But significant enough for Chris Stones to discuss this with you, and for you to ask about it and him to discuss it with
Yep.
you. So it was on your mind that it may become a critical incident.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I will come back to that, but can I ask you, at that stage, I think on paragraph 25 of your inquiry statement, you say the lead for the incident at that time was Inspector Stephen Kay. He was the PIO, and what does that stand for?
Police Incident Officer.
And you established from Chris, that'd be Chris Stones, that Inspector Kay was on duty in Kirkcaldy and he had command of that incident. Was that what Chief Inspector Stones told you, that Inspector Kay had command of the incident?
I can't recall any of the exact phraseology, but that would have been, I mean, the PIO, experience tells you that the PIO at that point in time, an ongoing investigation or incident, certainly the incident, the PIO was in charge.
Right.
So whether Chris told me, I'm sure he probably did, but if not, I would have made that assessment.
Right. So from your perspective, Inspector K being the PIO, he was in charge.
Absolutely.
And then I think in paragraph 27 you say, if we can look at that, that's lovely, thank you. To explain with a fast-moving incident such as this, the initial command sits with the PIO who has immediate oversight. Now, can you explain to us what initial command means?
So exactly that is that when the call first comes in and the officers first get deployed, the role of the PIO, especially with it being a very serious number of calls from independent people, my expectation and what Stevie would have done, I'm sure, is take oversight of that incident as it is actually evolving.
Mm-hmm. And can you explain to us what it means when an inspector, a PIO, takes oversight? What does that actually look like in reality?
So he may be sitting, because we have a police incident officer that at that particular time on a Sunday morning would probably have oversight of the whole of Fife at that time. So I never listened to Stephen's evidence, but I'm guessing he probably is sitting somewhere in a police building, and he'll have a computer in front of him that will tell him every incident that's ongoing across Fife. And I'm again assuming he probably got phoned or heard it on the radio that this was ongoing, and then Stephen would have made his assessment at that time and may or may not have given instruction to the police officers. I'm second guessing now, but that would be the role of the PIO, is to understand the incident, to provide any advice and guidance to the officers if it is required. And my expectation in certain circumstances would be that the PIO, if it was so serious, would attend the incident to take genuine sort of grip and oversight of what was ongoing.
And you say understand the incident and give guidance to the officers. Is that to the response team officers that are attending the incident?
Yeah, I mean, it may not always be required, because you will have a sergeant that is on duty as well, and he or she may be giving that instruction. So the PIO may simply be listening to that and agreeing or disagreeing, and then they would come in and I would assume they would come in and give guidance. But if the sergeant or whoever was giving the right instruction, then it might just be a watch and listen brief.
So there, in this case, actually, there was a sergeant with the response team, not at the front of them, but arriving later. If the PIO is content with the instructions being given by the sergeant, he can just sit and watch.
Yes.
And listen on the radio, monitor the situation.
Yes.
And I think you say paragraph 62 of your inquiry statement, it was never declared a firearms incident, so the command of the incident remains with Stevie K. That's the PIO.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. So this is beyond the sort of initial command. It will remain with him throughout, will it?
Yes.
But you say in paragraph 62, if it had been declared a firearms incident, I would have retrospectively reviewed the decisions taken and determined whether the criteria for deployment of firearms had been met. So you would have become involved in a more active way if it had been declared a firearms incident.
Yes, but only because, and it's the paragraphs before that probably explain it a little bit better. But my role on the day, I was out not as Fife Policing Commander. I was out on duty as the Strategic Firearms Commander for Scotland. So part of that role was to to have oversight of any firearms incidents that had happened through the night and or that were ongoing. But also part of my dual role that weekend was to take an interest in oversight on any ongoing issues or any serious crimes that had happened through the night.
Those seem to be very responsible roles individually. As a dual role at that time in the morning, was that quite a burden on you in terms of your capacity to deal with that?
Not particularly, because how these things, I mean, firearms incidents, there'll be experts and you can get the data from Police Scotland, but, you would average, over the course of, so I would do that firearms responsibility a week at a time, so it would be once every 4 or 5 weeks, and it would rotate round other commanders that were trained, and you would probably average between 5 to 8 firearms incidents across Scotland during that week, and that would require, if one happened at 2 in the morning, to say on a Tuesday morning, then I would be phoned at that time, and my expectation, or the expectation would rightly be that I would take involvement. This incident was never declared a firearms incident, so my role on the Sunday morning was not as a firearms commander. My role was because I was out I was out on call for other non-firearms incidents as well as firearms incidents. So I'm not explaining that particularly well, but firearms, that did not come into the equation in this incident. I was out as a chief superintendent with oversight of any serious criminality or serious incidents that may have happened.
So that was if I could say, that was the hat you had on in
Yes.
relation to this, not in
Yes.
relation to firearms.
No.
That had nothing to do with your role
It had
or
never
your
been
involvement.
declared. It had never been a firearms incident, this, so I had no involvement.
All right. And then in paragraph 67, you say the command remained with, here we are, command remained with K when he was in the canteen. So I'm asking who was managing the response officers. The PIO, Stevie K, was still in charge of them at this point. They were not now operationally deployed, so line management-wise, it was still with Inspector K, but they're not deployed, so it's pretty self-contained with all officers sitting in the canteen. So this is at a later stage, but he remains in command of the response team in his
Yes.
role as PIO.
Yes,
So from the initial moment he hears about it right up until they're in the canteen,
yes,
he's the PIO and in charge.
yeah.
So if I ask you a question, who was in charge in relation to the response team and what happened, can you tell me who that is?
At that particular, or what point in...
Well, from the initial moment the calls come in to the canteen,
Is Stevie K is the PIO.
he's the person in
Yes.
charge of that incident. Right, thank you. We've heard from Inspector Key. We heard from him in November last year, on the 23rd, and he talked about seeing a call card coming in. It was a grade 1 high-risk incident. He talked about having a computer screen and a
Right.
radio
Yep.
on. And he said that I would be listening out for ACRs and the sergeant's grip, and I would need more information before I got involved if required. Does that make sense to you from what you know about a PIO? They would need more information?
I think it makes sense that the sergeant, whoever he's referring to there, if there is a
this
sergeant on
Sergeant
duty,
Maxwell?
then, as I touched on earlier, a PIO would be listening in actively, but if the sergeant's doing and instructing all the right things, then there would be no need for Stevie to intervene, because all that would do is just complicate matters. So if it's been managed properly in the PIO's view, then a watch and brief would make sense.
So we've heard evidence that the acting police sergeant for the response team was Sergeant Maxwell, that he called for an ARV, an armed response vehicle, and a dog unit. And I think Inspector Kay said that he was content with that approach. So that would be fine for him to sit and listen and not actively intervene at that time.
Yeah, I would question the sergeant asking for an ARV. What would be the purpose of that? And that would not be a decision for Stevie Kay. That would be a decision for the inspector that is in Bilston, and he or she would then have to make an assessment on whether the criteria to move firearms from wherever they are in the country to wherever the acting sergeant wants them to be. That would then, a firearms decision would have to be the inspector in Bilston.
In terms of Inspector Kay listening to that from the acting police sergeant on the Sunday morning responding to the incident, would that cause any concerns? Do you think the Inspector Kay would have to get involved at that stage?
I would say so, yeah.
Why?
It's very unusual for a sergeant to be asking for armed response vehicles to be deployed. That would be something that would have to be clearly understood, the rationale, and there is real tight parameters around deployment of firearms. So yeah, that would not be that ultimately the decision would be Bilston. Anybody could ask for them, but the inspector in Bilston he or she would be the one that would make that initial decision.
We've heard from Inspector Kay that he did travel to the scene. You've talked about the PIO travelling to the scene, and he indicated that he would be there in 2 minutes at round about 7:37 in the morning, and then at 7:40 there was an airwaves transmission we've listened to previously that he said he'd just arrived. And that's normal, you've said, if it's a serious incident.
I'd say that's a very quick response, actually. 2 or 3 minutes later, he must have been based relatively close, maybe at Kirkcaldy or maybe Cowdenbeath Police Station.
I should perhaps have maybe misrepresented the position. The calls started coming in at 7:10. There were 6 calls to Bilston Glen, which were largely graded 1, high-risk incident. And we've heard from Inspector Kay that he was listening to these calls, listening to the airwaves communications between the officers and Sergeant Maxwell, and arrived at 7:40. So when you say it was a quick response, do you want...
Yeah, sorry, when you said minutes, I thought, I didn't understand. So 30 minutes, if that's what you're saying, roughly 30 minutes.
From the first call coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where Stevie was, because he's PIO, he can base himself anywhere in Fife. So, if he was, for example, in Dunfermline Police, I don't know where he was, I don't know if you know, but...
We'll just check that.
Aye, so it really depends on where he was, around how quickly he can get to the scene.
Yeah, okay, we can come back to
Okay.
that. Do you think there's a sort of reasonable time during which somebody would listen to calls coming in, multiple calls, grade 1, and think I better go now? Or do you think...
I think every situation's different, because, the reality is, if it's a fast-moving incident, for him to be, getting his jacket on, running to the car, sometimes the actual, remaining where you are and, checking the computer and taking notes or whatever Stevie was doing or not doing, I suppose it's a judgment call based on your own experience at the time.
Inspector Kay gave evidence and said that he thought Gary McEwan, yourself, would be overseeing the full thing with being the on-call super. Is that a fair respect?
So I wasn't the on-call super, I was on-call chief super. At that early stage, if you're not aware of something, you can't take control of it. It's those that are that are there at the time, and the PIO, ultimately that is their role, is to take command and oversight of ongoing incidents, and that's their responsibility, and that's what they have their training for.
And when did you first become aware of the incident involving Mr. Bio?
So when Chris Stones phoned me, is it 7:45, or I can't quite remember the time, but it's in my statement.
Thank you. In paragraph 52 of your inquiry statement, you talk again about Inspector Kay, and you say this is when you've arrived at Kirkcaldy Police Office. You went up the stairs and Inspector Kay arrived back at some point, and I did have a conversation with him around the circumstances as he knew it. When was this conversation?
So that I was at Kirkcaldy at that point, so that would have been, I don't know if there is a time earlier on, but it certainly would have been after 7:45 and before, I don't know, is it before or after the critical incident? I'll probably tell you in the statement.
If we go, I think your critical incident
Was it 9:10?
was at 9:10.
So
Your first meeting, I think, was at 9:30, which we'll come on to. I'm just interested if you have a recollection of when you discussed matters with Inspector Kay.
I don't actually. I think with the chronology, I think it may have been before the main meeting, but I'm not sure.
The main
actually.
meeting being the half-9 meeting,
half-
or the first gold group
The
meeting?
half-9 meeting.
So sometime before the half-9 meeting?
Yes.
Right, thank you. Do you remember what you discussed with him?
It was really just, one, how is he? Two, how are the staff? Three, as he understood it, what were the circumstances? And there was nothing really, from the earlier briefing from Chris Stones and what I'd seen from the call card, there wasn't really much more that I was being told at that time, because nobody had quite understood, nobody had come together and sort of had a full briefing around it. So everybody knew sort of different chunks, I suppose.
Can we look at paragraph 28, please? You talk there, my role was as local policing commander, not firearms commander. For me, there was an immediate concern about the welfare of my staff who had been involved in such a tragic incident, as well as ensuring Fife Division could continue to police Fife communities as best we could in relation to other incidents with a depleted resource. When you use the phrase depleted resource, can you explain that for us?
So, on a Sunday morning, there will not have been a huge number of staff on. Again, you could get that detail, but there will not have been, there is maybe a misconception, there's hundreds of police officers. There will not have been that in Fife on that morning. And with those that were involved in this tragic incident being removed, then it does create real vulnerabilities around how can we police the wider, and things don't stop because the police have been taken off the street. The communities are still waking up and still discovering crime, or there's still domestic violence ongoing, or whatever it may be. So I was genuinely concerned that we would not have enough police officers left to respond to the other ongoing incidents that will naturally happen.
And that was something that was part of your responsibility?
I certainly seen it as such, yeah.
I'm advised that it's in the morning Kay was at Kirkcaldy.
Right. So that's five minutes away from Hayfield Road.
All right, thank you. And so in light of that, that sort of short journey, the timings I gave you earlier were 7:10 was the first call coming in, and 6 calls came in eventually.
Yeah.
And the police arrived at 7:20.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears from the airwaves that Inspector Kay arrived at 7:40.
7:40.
Yes, 7:40 and 54 seconds. And there was a transmission on there saying, "That's me, just arrived." So 7:40 and 54 seconds. Looking at that time scale and your understanding of the role of PIO, you'd said earlier he responded very quickly. Do you wish to say any more about that?
Obviously, what I took from you was he was there within 3 minutes or whatever it was you said, so that's not the case. So it's 20 minutes. I mean, I've no idea what Stevie was doing at that point or who he phoned. 20 minutes is not excessive, to be honest with you. It's probably slightly longer than I would have liked, but it's not, it's not 2 hours later. He's there within 20 minutes. He's to find a car, he'll know of a car, he's to find car keys, there'll be all these different, he may need to use the gents, you don't know what was there, but 20 minutes is not excessive. But
I think in fairness, I don't think we heard evidence from Inspector Kay to suggest he had to go to the toilet or any of that type of thing.
I don't know.
Yeah. Can I ask you about something that was in PS 03136, please? I'm interested in page 2. Page 2 of the document. This is your, if I can call it, an operational statement.
Yeah.
And it's paragraph 1. And you'll see that this is where it says 7:45. So that was the time that you gave in your statement most recent to the events. On the Sunday, the 3rd of May, you were telephoned by Stones. Do you see that paragraph? The number of calls mentioned. And halfway down that paragraph it says, "A short time later I received a subsequent update that the IC3 male had fallen unconscious on contact with the police and was being administered CPR by the officers in attendance." Quite interested in that sentence there. So a short time later, this is shortly after your call with Chief Inspector Stones, you received a subsequent update. Who was that from?
Chris Stones again.
Oh, it was still the same person. And you say there an IC3 male had fallen unconscious. Now, for those listening who are not familiar with that use of language, what does IC3 mean?
So it means a black male. So IC1 is white North European, IC2 is white South European, and 3 is a black male, 4 is maybe an Asian male. I can't quite remember, but there's different terminology. I'm a wee bit out of the loop now, and that's just so it's absolutely clear in police terms what ethnicity of the person is that we're talking about.
Now, is it unusual to use that categorisation in an operational statement? We've not seen that used by many other officers. Right. I'm just wondering why you used it.
Yeah, it's something because it was police terminology, and I've just grown up. Or my era, I suppose, we would use that sort of terminology for different ethnicities.
And it says fallen unconscious on contact with the police. And I just wondered about your use of that phrase. It's something you also mentioned in your inquiry statement, that he'd fallen unconscious. Was there a reason you used that phrase? It sounds maybe not as clear as it might have. Fallen unconscious on contact with the police?
I wasn't mean to be uncertain, but no, it's maybe just, again, my terminology.
And is that something that you would use commonly, or is it something that you particularly used in this inquiry?
Is that sort of fallen unconscious, or, I think, well, from my era, again, that's maybe a more traditional in writing statements. That is some of the terminology that I would use.
Right, okay, thank you. We mentioned a moment ago about critical incident. I've got a few more questions about this. PS 03136, so this is the one we're on. Page 2, paragraph 3, please. You say shortly after 09:08 hours, on the same day I was informed that the male had been pronounced dead, and as such I made the decision to declare a critical incident, and that was at 9:10. That's what you said earlier.
Yep.
And you briefed the relevant officers to that effect. Who did you brief?
So I phoned the command and control, so Bilston, and asked them to broadcast that on the call card and to alert whomever they do. I don't know the processes, but it's about ensuring that nationally the organisation is aware that the police service have declared a critical incident. And then I also did brief ACC Nicholson via probably telephone that I declared that a critical incident.
And you're briefing senior people. How is that information, or is that information disseminated to lower ranks?
Yes, so that would be the purpose of Bilston. It's really to make sure not the whole of the organisation knows, but that the key people, senior or middle ranking staff across probably Fife and the Central Belt of Scotland were aware that there was a critical incident ongoing. And that's about, so middle managers are, so there may be, drugs operations that are planned for that day. There may be, other non-essential duties that staff in the Central Belt of Scotland were intending to do. And what that does is it alerts them so they can deprioritise these things, knowing that staff are going to be likely to be required to move towards the critical incident. So that becomes the priority.
So the managers, the senior managers are told about it, so they can consider resourcing and prioritisation. Is that information then shared with officers lower down in the ranks?
So that's what I'm saying, middle managers I would expect. So through Bilston, the inspector, because he or she has constant contact with other handlers, as in command and control handlers, and he'll have briefed them to the effect that there's a critical incident in Fife, it's been declared, and that would be cascaded across to other divisional areas, so then they can deprioritise things, knowing that they may need to move staff into the Kirkcaldy area.
So when a critical incident is declared, it's not just the senior officers who know about it?
No. No. Shouldn't be anyway.
And continuing on with that paragraph, you say, my rationale was that the effectiveness of the policing response into this death was likely to have a significant impact upon the confidence of the family and communities. My primary concern at this point was 1, the family involved, 2, the officers involved, and 3, any local or national community tensions that could arise as a consequence of the death. I'm interested in this paragraph. So this is after the death has been intimated to you, and you have appointed a critical incident.
Declared it.
Sorry. And this was your rationale. Can you tell us expand on what you say here?
So, it's exactly that there was a possibility that the fact that Sheku had died following police contact, that may have had a huge implication locally and nationally, so that's the community impact part, but also without doubt on Shek's family, immediate family and wider family, but also on the second point there around the officers involved. I mean, police officers, these officers, day shift, Sunday morning, they probably went to bed at 9 o'clock at night, knowing they're getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They then get up in the early hours of the morning, go out genuinely, I believe, to protect the communities, and this tragic incident has befolded them. So they were absolutely distraught, would be my assessment. So these were my 3 areas of concern. The family first, because they've lost a loved one, the officers involved in it, and then any wider community tensions that may come as a consequence.
Can we go back to your inquiry statement, please? And, oh, sorry, the Rule 8 response, I think, first of all. That is SBPI 00075. And if we can look at paragraph 2, that again says a male, this is in relation to the events at 9:08 in the morning. A male had died whilst being arrested by police. This is a highly significant event. In my view, the effectiveness of the policing response into this death was likely to have a significant impact upon the confidence of the family and the local communities, and thus for that reason I declared it a critical incident. And you also refer to another statement. So you saw this as, from that moment, shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning, you saw this as a highly significant event in terms of the repercussions, possible repercussions.
Yeah, I mean, to put it in perspective, I, at that point had, 25 years police service or whatever it may have been. I'd been head of the CID, I'd been involved in all major, or a lot of major inquiries. I had never declared a critical incident before in my entire career. So, that really puts it into importance for me. This is as far, it can't get any more serious than this in my eyes, so that's why I called it, or I'm sure it could with multiple victims or whatever, but this is as serious as it gets in my mind. My worry around the community impact was there going to be any perception from family or from wider communities that Sheikh had died as a consequence of the colour of his skin. That was one of the significant community impacts for me, and I wanted to really understand and hope that perception wouldn't manifest itself.
And looking at the timings, you find out it shortly after 9:08 in the morning, and then at 9:10 you declare a critical incident for the first time in your whole career. It didn't take a long time for you to appreciate the significance of this.
No, and I'd known prior to that obviously that he'd fallen unconscious, so it was already going through my mind, as you would expect for any police officer involved in this, is right, what is the worst case scenario here, and what needs to happen if that should come to fruition.
We've heard sort of mixed evidence about people's perception at the time. One officer spoke about, he realised that because someone had died, because it was a black man, the media would be very interested in the events. He realised the importance of this. Would you agree with that impression?
Absolutely. I mean, history tells us that. I'd not been involved in, but had exposure to other events down south in particular, and debriefs of them, where, black men had died following police contact, and the community impact on that around, in Manchester, in London, and I had the safety of the wider Scottish population to think about as well. So I wanted to try our hardest to ensure that that disorder and looting and other things that came in other areas didn't happen in Kirkcaldy, Fife, or across Scotland.
And that awareness of events around the UK in Manchester and London, is that something particular to you and your experience, or?
No, there'll be many other senior officers that will have had that training, that debrief, the various courses that myself and others, many others will have went on, that you get an insight into how that transpired very quickly, and how communities can change their some parts of the community, not all, but and then can embark upon widespread disorder and criminality.
You've mentioned a concern that you had, that there may be a perception that he died as a consequence of his skin colour. And why was that of concern to you?
Because had that perception manifested itself, then that could lead to the disorder and other criminality that I talk about. The one that always stuck with me, it was a few years before, I can't remember the exact date, but the one down south, Mark Dugan, he died following police contact, and that literally created shockwaves across the whole South England into the sort of Middle England. So I was acutely aware that why could that not happen in Scotland if it happened in England? So as a police officer, a senior police officer at the time, you don't want that to happen, so you're wanting to try and put as many measures in place to try and prevent that from happening.
And if you're putting measures in place to try and prevent it, were you hoping to be able to avoid that perception?
I wasn't one. You can't prejudge the inquiry at that time, but I just wanted to make sure that we had sufficiencies of resource, skill sets and staff available to step up to address whatever might come to fruition.
So I'm interested in that. You've said you don't want to prejudge the inquiry. Would you have anticipated that the inquiry, the investigation into the death, would take this into account, the possibility that the man has died because of the colour of his skin, or that has been a factor in his death?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So would you have expected the senior investigating officer to include that as one of the possibilities that he would wish to investigate?
Well, I had it in my mindset. I mean, whatever, I can't really comment on what an SIO did or did not put in there, but I certainly, it was in my mindset, yes.
We've already heard from the SIO
Right.
and spoken to him about
Okay.
this. So, but certainly that was in your mind from an early stage in the morning after you spoke to Chief Inspector Stones, and then you declared a critical incident at 9:10 in the morning.
Yes.
And did you take any active steps in relation to your concerns about this possible perception and the possible concern?
So as the day went on, myself and others did, which I'm sure you might come to, I'm guessing,
Yes.
around the sort of, the contact, the community reassurance group, which is a really important conduit to understand how communities are feeling, but also, and for me more importantly, the family, to really understand how the family are feeling, and to, just to try and just build a relationship with the family, I suppose, is probably the best way to do it, to describe it.
I'm going to come on to that in some detail during the course of today.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this community group that you've mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So it probably features in one of the early. So just to jump back a little bit, Nicola Shepherd, who I know you've heard from here,
Yes.
she was the chief inspector that had oversight of Kirkcaldy area. So she was off duty on the Sunday, and I asked her to come in. And one of the primary reasons for that was because Nicola knew all the officers far better than I did in Kirkcaldy, but also understood the local community better than I did, because she was the local area commander, and I felt that she would really add value to that area. And as a consequence of that, we established the community reassurance group, which was ultimately chaired and led by Nicola, and that was to try and understand the impact that this incident was having on minority communities primarily, but also wider communities as well, because it does not, the impact of this will not just be within the minority communities. It absolutely will have an impact across all communities.
Thank you. Can we come back to your inquiry statement, please? I should have asked you about this paragraph
Right.
when we were talking about critical incident. Sorry, paragraph 38. and I'll just complete this. You've talked about the significance of declaring a critical incident in terms of your own career.
Yep.
You've said here critical incidents get the resource they require. At that point, I don't know what's required, but hypothetically, if I needed 100 police officers from across the country, I would get it. So it's taken very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Across Scotland, there might be only 1 or 2 critical incidents a year. They are not normally declared or routine. The declaration is based on professional judgment. It alerts the highest officer in the country, who was Steve House at the time. That's the Chief Constable. It makes him aware of that incident, and by default, priorities and resources are then provided as required. So I think you said earlier this was the most serious it can get. Is that?
In my view, yes.
If police officers at a lower rank find out there's been a critical incident, and there's only 1 or 2 a year, do they take that seriously, or is it only the more senior officers?
No, I would expect them to take it as serious. I mean, it's, by definition, it means the whole of the organisation are aware of it, or they should be aware of it, and the senior people are focused on it, and will, as you see with ACC Nicholson, will actually attend. That's not the norm. So officers will get a sense, if they don't know, that this is really serious. The fact that there are so many members of staff and senior officers coming to Kirkcaldy Police Station.
So even if they haven't been formally told about it being a critical incident, they can tell from the arrival of very senior officers.
Yeah.
And does it make a difference to the way the incident is managed, post-incident management after the event, if it's declared a critical incident?
So I don't know if you're going to get into the post-incident stuff.
Yes,
So I'm not quite sure what you mean then. So the post-incident, a critical incident, because there are so few, eventually you can decriticalise it, if that is even a word, which basically means that at a certain point in the journey, this is no longer a critical incident and it's regraded as such and downsized. But that tends to take, it could take days, it could take weeks, it could take months. It really depends on the situation or the incident.
Now, in paragraph 41, I think, of your inquiry statement, you say that any officer can actually declare a critical incident. But how often would it happen that a constable or someone of a lower rank would actually do that?
I've never been aware of it.
No. So theoretically possible, but not common in practice.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Right. Could you just give me 1 moment? I'm conscious of the time, and we
Yes.
normally have a break.
Well, I think we'll take a
appreciate
break now. We'll take a break for 20 minutes.
Thank you.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a 9:30 meeting that you've told us about in your inquiry statement. And I think you said it was a teleconference meeting that you had with ACC Nicholson. And was that a normal sort of 9:30 meeting that you would attend?
Yeah, at the weekend it would be a sort of opportunity just to get, for the ACC and other senior members of staff, to get a sort of operational oversight of what has happened in the preceding 24 hours.
Right. And I think you refer to this at paragraphs 29 and 30 of your inquiry statement. So convened at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and you mentioned this incident to ACC Nicholson at that time.
Yes.
And you say, long story short, we had a discussion about this incident. I spoke to Chief Inspector Conrad Trickett and asked him to travel down to take over PIM procedure for the staff, so that's post-incident management procedure.
Yes.
And then at 30, this meeting took place after I had been informed of Sheku's death and after I had declared a critical incident. And you mentioned that. So it's after the critical incident has been declared. You have a sort of customary meeting with ACC Nicholson. You discuss the incident with Nicholson at that time, and you have a conversation with Conrad Trickett.
Yes.
And we've heard from Chief Inspector Trickett, and he's told us that he was PIM trained at that time. Was that something that was unusual amongst the staff?
Yeah, it's a very specialist training skill. Yeah.
We've heard that Pat Campbell had never been trained in post-incident management procedure. Was that unusual at the time in 2015?
Yeah, it depends on how you move through your career. You build up certain specialisms, so you would never expect Pat Campbell to be PIM trained because he's an investigator, so he would be focused on investigation, whereas Conrad was not an investigator, so he got the training to be a PIM.
We did hear from Conrad Trickett that he spoke a different language from Pat Campbell because he was PIM trained and Pat Campbell wasn't. And in relation to obtaining statements and information about the incident from the attending officers, that there was maybe a mismatch between their understanding of the types of statements. Are you aware of anything of that sort happening?
No, but I could see why different languages, maybe too strong a phrase, but I could see why they're two distinctly different skill sets. So and if each does not, each probably had a reasonable understanding of what the other did, but maybe not. They hadn't been through the necessary training. So I could understand why there'd be a little bit of uncertainty there. But that would, I'm assuming, through dialogue between the two, that would be resolved pretty quickly.
Right. Can I be clear just about the comparison between your role, having regard to the welfare of the officers, and that of Conrad Trickett? We heard from Conrad Trickett that his role as post-incident manager was to balance the needs of the investigation with the welfare of the officers. And he gave that evidence on day 45, which was March this year. You've talked about your role also involving issues of welfare. Can you explain to us how your roles differ, or if there's any difference really?
No, I think they're mutually inclusive actually, and they complement one another. I mean, historically, a PIM process, so because I'd been a firearms commander and been a detective super, I had an understanding of both sides of the inquiry, or both these areas in particular. But the post-incident management procedures had never been put in place for a non-firearms incident before. This was highly unusual and highly unique. And the reason that, I put it in place with Conrad and with Rory's support is that, I could see...
Can I stop you there? Sorry, I don't like interrupting,
Sorry.
but when you say Rory, we've actually
ACC,
had a number of Rorys.
Sorry. Okay.
Is that
ACC Nicholson. It was obvious, such was the seriousness of the the investigation, the inquiry and the incident, certainly felt the staff would benefit from having a PIM process wrapped around them, but also the investigation would, because it creates a clear audit trail, whereas historically there wouldn't be the level of detail and documentation through the PIM. If you didn't use a PIM structure, there wouldn't be the same level of policy, criteria, documentation that inquiries such as this can then refer to.
What sort of documentation would be prepared as part of the PIM procedure?
And I've not seen it, but I'm assuming there would be a PIM log that Conrad would have completed. And
we heard about that.
Right, and that's really thorough. Or that so in a normal set of circumstances, then none of that would be available for any future inquiry. So one of the reasons that I was keen to get the PIM process was so there was a clear documentation of every decision that was made, but also for the staff, because it was a really, I know I've mentioned it before, a traumatic episode for them, and it was really important for me that they got as much welfare support as they possibly could, and I felt that Conrad and that process would add value to that.
Right. So in a normal incident, there wouldn't be any of that PIM paperwork prepared?
Nothing.
Would
No.
there'd be nothing?
Nothing, unless it was a firearms incident, but in a traditional, normal incident, none of that would be available.
Right. And can I ask you about another officer we're hoping to hear from later this week, Leslie Bowl. Now, as I understand, part of your role was in relation to resourcing and ensuring there was the proper resourcing. And we have an inquiry statement from Leslie Bowl, SBPI 00223. I don't need to put this on the screen,
Okay.
It's just for the benefit of anyone listening, paragraph 69, where she says that initially her role was to try and assist the SIO by getting required resources, any specialist resources, speaking with him if I had any concerns, and generally supporting him in any way I could. And again, is there really any difference there, or is her role mirroring your role? Because you've also talked about resourcing.
Yeah, so there's two distinct, and I don't know if there is a chart available, but the command structure of this incident is really clear in my head, and that you would have ACC Nicholson as the gold commander. You would have me as the silver commander with oversight of my staff that have been involved in the incident, community tension, community impact, but then you would have Leslie Bowl as an experienced detective officer to have oversight and supporting Pat Campbell in the role, or Pat's role initially as the senior investigating officer. So both Leslie and I would be keen and interested in making sure there was the right resource in the right place, but it's different types of resource that we're looking for. I'm looking for professional police officers that can continue business continuity. Leslie and Pat Campbell are looking for specialist investigators to progress the inquiry with PERC, or on behalf of PERC.
So her role is more aligned to the role of the
Yes,
senior investigating
absolutely.
officer.
Yeah.
Whereas you're looking at things from a police continuity,
Yeah, community
a broader
impact,
approach.
business as usual, yeah.
Right. Thank you. And then you mention in your inquiry statement that before you attended the first Gold Group meeting, which I'll come to in a moment, which was at 11:30 in the morning, you went to the canteen. So at some point between the 9:30 meeting with ACC Nicholson
Yes.
and before the 11:30, the first Gold Group meeting, when was it that you went to the canteen?
So I couldn't tell you the exact time. So it was exactly that. It was between sort of both those times, and I just felt it was important as the policing commander of Fife to go and see how my staff were. So I took the decision to go there. But then I had Conrad Trickett and I had a discussion, so I knew that Conrad was coming down, albeit I think it was in Dundee or Aberdeen. So that was going to take a bit of time, but I felt it was important that staff were made aware of that, and also I was genuinely interested in and how they were.
Was Conrad Trickett present when you went to the canteen?
No, he'd probably just left Aberdeen, so he was en route.
So does that help you recall if the meeting was closer to the 9:30 meeting or closer to the Gold Group?
I think it would have been closer to the 9:30. Once I got the business of the initial meeting out the way, my priority was to see how my staff were.
And so when you went to the canteen, was that the first time you'd been to the canteen?
Yes.
And that was before Conrad Trickett arrived at
Yes.
Kirkcaldy Police Office? Did you have any other visits to the canteen?
I was there during that period. I was there twice,
All right.
and both for the sort of the same purpose. Really, it was just. I think the first time I was, somebody fed back to me around. They'd not had their anything to eat and stuff like that. So once I went away and basically asked somebody to help with that, and then I went back and just said, look, just for your information, that's in hand now, you don't need to worry about that. I was more interested around, family, because things were, or would likely have been beginning to build on media, across neighbourhoods, chit-chat, and, it was important that the family members of the staff, if required, were alerted to the fact that their loved one had been involved in this, and I made that offer, and at that point it wasn't required, but the offer was there, and I would have personally done that if it was required.
And the second time you went back, do you remember when that was?
It was again during that sort of 1.5 hour window, because I just went and made the arrangements for the officers to get the necessary refreshments and stuff.
So that was between the 9:30 with ACC Nicholson and the 11:30 First Gold Group meeting?
Yeah.
How long did the 9:30 meeting last?
On average, it's normally about 30 minutes, but I suspect, and I don't know, it's so long ago, but I suspect it probably went on a little bit longer because of this incident and, the discussion that we had to have around the next steps.
So after that first meeting, you have your first visit to the canteen, and your second visit, was Conrad Trickett there at the second visit?
No, because it was very quickly after the first one. I just went and sorted, as I say, refreshments and stuff, because staff weren't. They were needing a bit of hand. They were needing to be looked after.
Did you have a visit to the canteen at any time during the day when Conrad Trickett was present in the canteen?
I don't think so. No, not from memory.
Could you be mistaken about that?
I could be. I mean, again, I've not listened to what Conrad said, but if he said I had been there, then I wouldn't dispute. I just can't remember.
I'm having something checked, and we
okay.
might come back
Okay,
to this
that's fine.
later on.
That's fine.
But that's your that's your best recollection
Yeah.
today. And I think you've said in your response to our relate request, the first time you got in touch with inquiry, and then your second inquiry statement, you said it was really purely for welfare purposes that you were visiting.
It was.
Did you consider whether you turning up in the canteen would maybe be quite a surprise or quite upsetting to the officers because you're so senior?
I would hope it. If it was upsetting, that was not my intention. I was genuinely there to show sort of to provide any help and welfare. I think it would be remiss of a terrible incident such as this for a senior leader not to be visible and not to sit with staff and just just be there for them.
And what did you say to the officers?
Not a great deal, to be honest with you, because there was a lot of upset and tears in that room, and I just tried to reassure them that, to reassure them that we had Conrad Trickett coming down. We're going to put in place a post-incident management procedure, which one of the requirements of that is to look after staff and the welfare of the staff, and to make sure that every ask of them was within reason was going to happen. I mean, if you go back to other other incidents that there was no PIN procedure, literally officers would come back and they would get a 5-minute from their supervisor, you okay, yeah, I'm fine, and that would be it. So this was a really robust, in my view, a professional approach to make sure the short-term and the long-term welfare needs of the police officers were catered for as best we possibly could.
And can I ask you about you were asked at paragraph 71, I think, of your inquiry statement, about separating the officers or having them all together in the canteen. And you were asked by the inquiry team about conferral, if we can put that label on it. And you say for conferral, other than putting a gag on them or putting them in different rooms, we couldn't prevent some possibility of that. But against that, I said, when I was in the canteen, that they should not talk about the incident. I said not to discuss it and to be patient and wait for Conrad's arrival. I didn't consider putting them in different rooms. I was happy where they were. They were professional people. They were told not to discuss the incident. They were devastated, tearful, upset and shocked. They weren't in a condition to discuss the incident. To separate them didn't make sense. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more about your views at that time. Did you consider the possibility of separating them?
So the question, at 71 I am asked about conferral. The question from memory that was put to me was along the lines of, could you have, if they were in the same room, could you tell them to not talk about the incident? And that was my reply, other than putting a gag on them. I mean, you know, you have to, these are mature professional adults. My advice to them was, look, we've got Conrad Trickett coming down. He'll explain the whole process from here on in, right through. He'll look after your welfare needs. Just take this time really to just try and, you know, gather your own thoughts and, you know, and just await the next part of the process. So that was really, you know, I tried to be really not necessarily humble, but considerate, because these people were, genuinely, they were devastated. They were really, really upset, you know. So probably most of what I said to them probably didn't even sink in, but I thought it was important. One, the visibility, because they may or may not still remember that I did actually show up, and two, to try and separate them as they were at that point. I could see no benefit to it.
Why did you think it was important for them not to discuss the incident?
Because I think if you start to, it's like, you know, it's not necessarily in policing, it could be in anything. If you start, everybody has a different view to, you know, this whole experience just now. The chap to my right's view will be different from mine around what I did or did not say. So if you begin to discuss, it just actually clouds the whole matter as it is in your own head. So for me, you're better just to keep your thoughts to yourself at that point, and then when the process begins, you'll have your opportunity to write it down or to tell whoever it is that you choose to tell.
And given your impression of the officers and how they were reacting, and that they might not take in your suggestion that they shouldn't discuss the incident, do you feel there were other safeguards in place at the time to prevent them talking to each other? I'm not suggesting gags or anything.
No, the reality was they were in a room together. I don't think they were of a mindset to be talking about the incident, to be absolutely honest with you. They certainly didn't when I was there, and that was not in any way visible to me. There was a Federation rep there, but no other safeguards, no.
And in terms of your perspective about thinking about the wider interests, the community tensions or the public's perception, was it of any, looking back on that now, the officers being gathered together in the canteen, do you have any concerns about how that might, the public perception of that?
I could see I could see the public perception. You know, people can put a different or a certain perspective on anything. I genuinely don't think it was a concern at that point, but I do understand the point you're making.
Looking back now, do you think if you could go back and do anything differently, Would you do that differently in light of what you knew at the time?
So, if I was to do it differently, we would have had to move the staff to all corners of sort of Fife. So there was not sufficiency of rooms and accommodation in Kirkcaldy to separate them all. So, if I'd made the decision to separate them, I would have had to then get 2 members of staff to take each witness and move them to one to go to Cowdenbeath, one to Dunfermline, one to Leavenmouth, and logistically, that it's a mess that to do that, and we wouldn't have had the resource to do it anyway, because that would be pulling more police officers off the street to go and to be taxi drivers, for want of a better phrase, and that logistically would never have worked. So, with hindsight, if this was to happen today, we would still require far more accommodation to do that realistically.
And when you were visiting the officers, did you tell them that there'd been a critical incident declared by you?
Yeah, I did actually. Yeah.
Was that at the first meeting, or the first visit, or the second?
It would have been the first one.
First visit. Right. Can I move on and ask you about
Just before you do that, I'm sorry to interrupt, can I just clarify one thing, please, Mr. McEwan? During that period, when you visited them and before Conrad Trickett arrived, was there any other officer, senior officer but junior to you, supervising the officers?
No, there was a sergeant there who had been involved in it, but no inspector or chief inspector, no sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I move on and ask you about Colette Bell, who was the partner of Mr. Bayo? And we've heard evidence that she was taken to Kirkcaldy Police Office during the morning. She'd phoned in about 8:30 in the morning from her home in Kirkcaldy, and then officers had taken her in to the police office. I don't know if you've listened to any of that evidence.
No, I've not actually.
Right. Did you at the time know that Colette Bell had been brought to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
There's a chance that, yeah, most likely at the 11 o'clock gold meeting, or whatever time it was.
11:30.
11:30, I would suspect, because Colin Robson gave a very thorough briefing at that, and I would suspect that would have been included in the briefing.
We've heard that she was already in Kirkcaldy by the 11:30
Yeah.
Gold Group meeting. So were you involved in any way with the decisions about bringing Colette Bell to?
No, that's
Kirkcaldy?
the SIO that would make those decisions, albeit, most likely, less likely to be Pat Campbell, because these are quite straightforward and important decisions to make. More likely Colin Robson would have made them as the initial SIO on the ground.
Right. Can I ask you something about evidence we heard from DC Mitchell? He was one of the officers involved in bringing Colette Bell
Right.
to the station. That was day 35 of the inquiry on the 1st of February this year. And he was one of the officers who had delivered the death message to Colette Bell.
Right, okay.
And that was in Kirkcaldy Police Office. She had her baby with her, and her mother had come to help her. And at that time, DC Mitchell gave evidence that he'd had a direction from supervisors that we weren't to mention anything to do with police contact, so that Mr. Bayo had come into police contact until it was properly investigated. And I asked him, this is DC Mitchell, when you say a direction from your supervisors, who do you mean? And he said that was relayed to us by DS Dursley. And he was told not to mention police contact. I'm interested, you've talked about the importance of the family and your role. I'm interested if you have any comments on this evidence that Officers were told not to mention to Colette Bell that Mr. Bio had come into contact with the police.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I don't know the full circumstances of the investigation at that point. My immediate reaction was that was not the right thing to do. But I don't know, you know, there may have been other discussions in the background in the investigation strand, but I suppose the question, if I was there that day, I would have said, why not? Why wouldn't we?
And in terms of your perspective about thinking about community tensions and the potential, the ramifications, what concerns would you have about not sharing that information with Colette Bell?
It's less about the community tensions. It's more about treating Colette Bell as I would want my partner to be treated in similar circumstances.
All right. I mean, I think there's 2 paragraphs in your inquiry statement I'd like to ask you to look at. Paragraph 85. You say, it was vital in my mind, and let me just, I'm not sure what line that's on. 5 lines down, thank you. So it starts at the end of the 4th line down. They had tragically lost a family member and it was vital in my mind. Do you have that?
Yeah.
That we were as engaging and being honest with them at the earliest possible time without obviously compromising the investigation. And was that the approach you would have taken with the family?
And that's the one caveat. I don't know, I mean, you'll have asked others, I don't know if by telling Colette Bell something would that have compromised the investigation. There is nothing that's obvious to me, but that was my area of responsibility.
Thank you. We have asked other witnesses that. In paragraph 104, you use a phrase I'm interested in. This is at a later time, but you say this is about Colette Bell was at Addie and Caddy's house when I went up. Often it's about getting one version of the truth. I'll come on to that visit later.
Okay.
But I'm interested in the phrase, getting one version of the truth. Can you explain that?
So, it's, again, it's a little bit out of sync, but for me it's about, is best, you know, from my perspective and from other police officers, if you have various different family members, for me it's about trying to get everybody together. If you're going to give them, it's in general sense, if you're going to, that's why briefing and debriefing is important in general terms, because if you get everybody together, then there's no dubiety around what it is that's being said. If you have to brief different people on different, or about the same topic at different times and places, the truth and versions of the truth can be diluted.
So if you're telling people the truth, there will be one version of that from the police?
Yeah, but there's, of course, it's like statements, of course, as you give one summary, but then if somebody comes and asks you a slightly different question from a slightly different perspective, then you give more information or you change, you know. So it's as you know as well as me, things can change and evolve. So best practice for me is where possible, you know, if you can get the collective family together, then that would surely be the best approach, but that's only where possible.
Thank you. I said I would come on to the Gold Group meetings,
Okay.
and the first one was at 11:30 on the 3rd of May. Let's have a look at the minutes from that meeting. PS 06491, please. And you have been asked about this in your inquiry statement. So we see this is the Gold Group, 11:30 on that date. We see that present was ACC Nicholson. We've heard he was the Gold Commander.
That's right.
You are there, Chief Superintendent McEwan. We've heard you were Silver Commander.
Yep.
And then we see the other attendees, Detective Chief Superintendent Leslie Bowl, Detective Superintendent Campbell, Chief Inspector Shepherd, you've mentioned all of those, and you've also mentioned Detective Inspector Robson, who was taking the minutes, and we've heard that he was a duty SIO for Fife on that day, and he gave the sort of factual briefing
Yeah,
at
that's
the
correct.
outset. And then someone called Kate Finlay from media. What was her role?
She was just from corporate communications. It's important with incidents such as this and others that you have a media expert there. Should you wish to cascade any messages out to the media, it's important that they get a really good grasp and understanding of the inquiry, because what tends to happen, or what does happen, is that the media outlets will go direct to Kate Finlay, as it was in this instance. If they have any further follow-up questions, they'll not come directly to me, they'll go through the corporate comms.
And we've heard about the gold and the silver commanders. Who were the bronze commanders?
So the bronze commander that's there is Nicola Shepherd. So she's the bronze commander for community impact and community reassurance, reporting to me. I'm trying to think what other bronze commanders there may have been. They're clearly not there, but there may be a commander in charge of, or a bronze in charge of locust protection. So there might be an inspector that has responsibility for that. There may be others kicking involved. But
And
yeah.
in terms of the investigation itself, we know that Pat Campbell was the SIO.
Yeah.
Would he be a bronze commander, or would that be someone different?
No, I wouldn't. I would class him as the senior investigating officer. I wouldn't class him as a bronze commander. No.
Is there ever a bronze commander for the investigation?
There may be through maybe a flow side. There might be a bronze commander that would look at the flow part of the investigation. Try to maybe forensic strategy. There might be a bronze commander that would look after the forensic side of things. So there would be other subsets that would support SIO and Pat Campbell.
But in terms of the investigation part of the incident, is Pat Campbell the top of the tree, if you like?
Support, yes. He's the key decision maker at that point, supported though by Leslie Bow, because she had previously been an SIO and was Pat's supervisor. So her role there is really to support Pat Campbell and helping him through, which is a really complex investigation.
So really it's Pat Campbell who's in charge of the
Yeah.
investigation.
Yes.
And he has, if I can use the word command that you used
Yeah.
earlier.
There can only be
he's the
one
man.
senior investigating officer, and that was at that point was Pat Campbell.
Okay. So it's not a situation where you as Silver Commander would interfere with this investigation, or ACC Nicholson would get involved. He would be the ultimate person responsible.
Yeah, I mean that can happen because everybody wants to get involved, but certainly having done the role that Pat was doing at that point, I understood how important it is to allow him to make his decisions, because if you get others interfering, it just actually makes things worse. So yeah, I mean the key is to allow him to make his decisions, and then he comes to the gold group and briefs out some of the key decisions that he's taken, and or maybe seek some advice if there is any advice that he's needing.
Okay. And PERC were not present at that meeting?
Not at that meeting, no, they hadn't arrived by that time.
And we've heard other evidence that they hadn't arrived by 11:30 that day. But others have talked about knowing that PERC were going to take the lead.
Yeah.
Is there a reason that you're aware of? You've talked about your earlier teleconference and people joining that way, and we can see that people were present at this meeting. Were you aware of any difficulties that prevented PERC from joining this meeting, either remotely or in person?
Not that I can't remember actually. There may have been, I don't know what the delay was for getting there, but I just can't remember what it was.
All right. And so with them not being present, how were the discussions in the Gold Group meeting going to be shared with PERC?
Once they arrived, they would, their key focus would be initially around discussions with Pat Campbell. They would get copy of the minutes if they were available, and they would be briefed by key police personnel, I suppose, on what had happened up until that point.
And who would those key personnel be?
So for me, it would be Pat Campbell, it would be Colin Robson, would be the two key, and they would probably have, I would imagine, when I was probably present at some, they would have had some discussion with the ACC as well as the Gold Commander.
Then we can look at the minutes further down the page, please. We see that the first item on this agenda for this meeting is terms of reference, gold strategy, Chief Superintendent Garry McEwan. And there's a list, if you like, of what you might have called paragraphs or bullet points or something, detailing the terms of reference. And I'm interested, you've been asked about this and the purpose of the terms of reference. If we look at the bottom one, it says, ensure the integrity, interest and reputation of the Police Service of Scotland and its staff is maintained and safeguarded. But then under that in red it says, agreed that wording of terms of reference would be considered and amended for future meetings to provide terminology specific to circumstances of incident. So this is the minutes. It's not the agenda, it's the minutes. But I'm interested in the terms of reference and the inclusion of the ensuring the reputation of the police, that be maintained and safeguarded. Can you give us some understanding of why that was included?
Because in Scotland, across the UK, not in the police anymore, but they police by consent of the communities. So if the police's reputation is tarnished to such a degree that the communities don't have the trust and confidence in the police officers to do their job, then who knows who knows where we would be in the country. So it's important that the communities at large see the police as an organisation that they can trust and that they will work with, because, as I say, we are the police by consent. So we need the communities and people to police with us. Excuse me.
What impact does that have on the investigation side?
For me, it's about making sure the investigation is done thoroughly, it's transparent, no stone is left unturned. It's about making the investigation as thorough and professional as it possibly can be, which in effect maintains that trust and confidence that communities have in policing.
Is any part of this term of reference about protecting officers from potential wrongdoing or avoiding investigating potential wrongdoing?
No, it's not about, absolutely not about avoiding investigation. It's about doing the most wholesome and fulsome investigation as we possibly can, so that the rights and wrongs are identified and are addressed.
I've said to you, we are hoping to hear from Leslie Bowl later this week.
Yep.
And she has commented on this in a written statement that she's given to the inquiry.
Okay.
And has expressed the view, and we've not heard from her yet, but in writing she's expressed the view that she didn't agree with that being part of the terms of reference. Decisions shouldn't be made to ensure this. Ensuring reputation of Police Scotland is not objective and not transparent. I think I would have raised this in my meeting and she'd picked up on that. So she obviously, looking at that, has expressed concerns about this being included. Looking at that now, do you have concerns about this being included as part of the terms of reference?
I suppose Leslie must be looking at it from a different perspective. I don't recall her raising that at the meeting, or I'm assuming it may have been amended at the time. So I mean, those 5 bullets, they were not commonly used, but these tend to be some of the phraseologies that were used at the time. They can always be improved upon, so I don't dispute what she's saying. That's her view.
Were they standard sort of terms of reference in a gold group?
Yeah,
meeting?
they were not unstandard. They were, maybe not for a traditional gold, but for a critical incident, you would find that a lot of that terminology is most likely in the policy. If you had access to the policy, you'd find a lot of that is in probably the major investigation manual.
And then we see the words in red that I read out. These are part of the minutes after item 1. Agreed that wording of terms of reference would be considered and amended for future meetings to provide terminology specific to circumstances of incident. Do you remember an agreement being reached as part of that discussion?
I don't remember the conversation, but I'm not surprised by that. Terms of reference rightly does evolve as any inquiry progresses, so that would be normal. I would expect that to be the case.
All right.
Yeah.
But you don't remember any specific discussions?
I
at that
can't.
meeting?
I can't remember that.
Right.
If anybody did raise that, I would accept that would be a fair comment. You know, these do require to be amended and changed, and I think they did to a degree as they moved on through the
Can we-
gold groups.
Sorry, I
Sorry,
interrupted
no, it's
you.
fine,
No.
yeah.
Could we look at SBPI 00075 again, please? And paragraph 3. So this is the Rule 8 response, your first statement, written statement to the inquiry. Paragraph 3. And you were asked about a gold group, and you say a strategic group chaired by the ACC where strategic decisions are made in connection to direction of investigation, costs, media, community or political interest. Can I ask you to explain more clearly what the role of the gold group is in relation to the direction of the investigation?
So how that would play out in real life is that, you know, Pat Campbell would give a briefing around at what point the investigation is at, and then, as I say, there may be some additional points he wishes to discuss or a certain direction he wants to take, and he'll be looking for the gold group to add value to that and to give advice, and or, you know, dependent upon the question that was posed, the ACC who chairs the group could make a decision around a certain hypothetical point that was being raised by the SIO.
Now, I'm interested because at this time, at this meeting, you were aware that PERC were going to take the lead on the investigation.
Yeah.
So how did that impact on the ability of the gold group and the police in general to direct the investigation?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question to ask, and I think that's probably reflected in the minutes, is there does not appear, if you go back, there's not a lot of decisions taken, and the reason that is because, or part of the reason was because, I think I used my statement as a sort of a foot on the ball moment, but it's the handover has been, as I understood it, the command of the incident as of maybe 10:30, give or take, had moved to PERC. The direction had come from Crown that PERC were going to lead on this investigation, but they weren't at the meeting. So, you know, the gold group were not going to make any or take any significant decisions unless they were life or death until PERC were there and had established themselves and taken physical control and ownership of the investigation.
How important is it in an investigation and taking the lead in an investigation to be physically present and part of the discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very important. And I understand sometimes, you know, again, it's a national organisation, so geographically it's, on a Sunday morning, you know, it's probably may have been more of a challenge to get the PERC resource there. but it's important. Of course, it's far better if everybody's in person and having that face-to-face discussion.
At this Gold Group meeting, did you have any input from PERC in relation to the investigation?
Not that I recall. Pat Campbell may have used phrases along the lines of "I've spoken to PERC" and this, but PERC physically were not there, and I don't recall any, direct input. No.
And to what extent, thinking again about the direction of the investigation, to what extent was the race of Mr. Bio and investigating any possible racial discrimination aspects in relation to his death? To what extent was that part of the strategic direction of the investigation?
That was not, from memory, that was not an emerging key discussion point at that meeting.
So you had obviously taken that very seriously in relation to declaring a critical incident. That had been done before this Gold Group meeting. But was there any discussion about race at that meeting?
Yeah, there was certainly discussion about race. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a comfort. I would say is probably the best way that Pat Campbell, with his experience and rank, was absolutely tuned into that fact.
Right. And what makes you say that?
Just it's hard to think back. I can't come out with any direct phrases, but it was. We're all, I'd like to think, in that group, bright and semi-intelligent people, and we understood the importance, and the fact I'd called it a critical incident, and the fact that the perception that I talked about earlier, the perception that might come from family, might come from communities, that was a real concern of mine. So that was known in the Gold Group.
And was that because you made that specifically known?
I'm sure I would have.
Can you help me understand? Obviously, it was an important factor in your consideration in declaring the critical incident, and that's a decision taken by you at 9:10 in the morning. So by 11:30, when you're having this first Gold Group meeting, how is it that information about a critical incident is shared more widely with the Gold Group?
So I would have briefed them on the fact, similar to what was in my statement. I declared it a critical incident at 9:10, and here was my rationale behind doing that, and just the procedures that I'd touched on there, and then here is the terms of reference that has been pulled together, and then we just worked through the agenda, I suppose.
So if they've not heard prior to 11:30, at least by 11:30, everyone in that Gold Group meeting knows it's been a critical incident.
Yeah, and to be honest, and I'd be shocked if any of those at that meeting at 11:30 didn't know before that. I think they did, and I'm sure they agree with that.
I mean, presumably when a critical incident is declared, that is disseminated pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
Excuse me. Sorry. Can I ask you, before we leave this first Gold Group meeting, can I ask you to look at PERC 00182? This is your statement from 2018. If we can just go down the page, it was January 2018. So this was the one we spoke about earlier this morning.
Yep.
And page 2, paragraph 6, please. Sorry, I haven't been counting from the top of the screen. Can you go back to the top of the screen so I can count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, great, thank you. I've been asked by investigator Sinclair, who briefed me regarding the incident involving Ch Bio. As I said in my first statement, at 11:30 I attended the Gold Group meeting chaired by ACC Nicholson. And you see who was present. And Detective Inspector Robson was a duty detective inspector that day, and he provided the Gold Group with details of the incident, and that's where I got my information from. So was that the sort of fullest detail of the information you'd had about the incident that day up to that point?
Yes.
And that came from D.I. Robson?
Yes.
And you've told us that, say, around about 7:45 you'd been contacted, and you've told us about your involvement in visits to the canteen and the meeting at 9:30 and such like. To what extent was Detective Inspector Robson's briefing at the Gold Group meeting significant to you? Was that to what extent did that provide you with more information?
Yeah, it was definitely more detailed than I'd had up until that point, but not significantly so. And the reason I say that is that, you know, none of the direct police witnesses involved in the case had been interviewed. They'd never given any detailed account. So the Gold Group for me was, D.I. Robson gave a high-level overview with a bit more detail, but then Gold Group is about, right, what is the next steps? What is it we need to be doing as an organisation to progress the inquiry, to reassure the communities, to address whatever financial, what costs there may or may not be. That was the purpose of the Gold. So Colin, you know, multiple calls about a man with a large knife, Hayfield Road, police attendance, man was restrained and fell unconscious, CPR, and he passed away at the hospital. It was as sort of as factual as that. There wasn't a great much more follow-up questions because we knew that nobody had any other answers at that point. Nobody knew nobody could really fill in the blanks.
So at this meeting you've had the factual briefing from Robson. You've declared the critical incident. Race is an important factor.
Yep.
You've been thinking about the potential ramifications of that and
Yep.
taking your decision about critical incident being declared. And the senior officer in charge of the investigation is present, Pat Campbell. Perk aren't there, but Pat Campbell has made reference to being in touch with Perk.
Yes.
So would you have anticipated that as part of the investigation being carried out, that the possibility that the death of Mr. Bio was contributed to by racial discrimination of some kind, would you have expected that possibility to be part of the investigation into his death?
I would expect that would have been one of the hypotheses that Pat may have considered. I genuinely don't know if it was, because I never seen Pat's evidence and I've not read his statement in detail, but I would imagine that would be one of the hypotheses.
So we have heard some evidence about hypotheses and an investigator thinking about all the possible hypotheses. And we may hear further evidence this week about this. And we've heard that one of the possible hypotheses is that Mr. Bio had been stabbed or injured in an assault earlier and had arrived at Hayfield Road and died as a result of an earlier assault. And we've heard that one of them could be an underlying health condition, and that's what caused his death. Are these the sort of hypotheses that you would expect
absolutely.
An investigator, keeping an open mind, would be looking at all of the possible options?
Yeah, that's the key of an investigator, is keep it as broad as you possibly can in the early stages, and then you begin to focus as you learn more and more about the particular incident.
And we've heard that what investigators do is consider all the possible hypotheses, within reason obviously.
Yeah.
And then once they get enough evidence to exclude a hypothesis, that they can then draw a line under it in a sense and move on and redirect resources to the hypotheses that are becoming
Yes.
more likely.
I would say that's
Yeah.
a good summary.
So you would expect one of the hypotheses to be that possible race discrimination has been a factor in his death, and you would expect that to be part of the investigation that was being considered.
Again, it's difficult for me because I was not part of the investigation, but yeah, I would be surprised if that was not included.
And before you could exclude that as a possibility, would you expect statements from police officers to be obtained?
Yeah, from any to eliminate any of the hypotheses, you need to be certain that that's no longer a likely
Right.
or likely scenario.
So it's included at the beginning, recognise that Mr. Bile was black and it's a possibility, and then you wait until you've got the statements you need, and then you can exclude it or draw a line under it.
Yeah, or whatever. You wait until you have the evidence to direct you in whatever direction you need to go.
If that wasn't included as a hypothesis, would that surprise you?
I think certainly, his race, I think, should have been considered. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I ask you about terrorism and the discussion at the Gold Group meeting to do with that? So if we can go back to the Gold Group minutes, I think they were 182 per, or no, let me just check. Oh, thank you. If we can look at item 3, please. And you'll see there's a whole list of bullet points there in item 3. It says investigative process, and it was spoken to by DCS Bowl and Detective Superintendent Campbell. Initial actions and investigation strategy outlined by Detective Superintendent Campbell in respect of the following areas. And I think there's about 9 bullet points listed there.
Yep.
And do you see quite beyond halfway down the bullet points, it says CT considerations. We've heard evidence that CT is counter-terrorism.
Yep.
And it says raised by ACC and to be reviewed by NIB. What was NIB?
I want to say National Intelligence Bureau, but I'm not entirely sure.
All right. Can I ask you what your recollection of this part of the discussion was about counter-terrorism?
I don't have a strong recollection around it. What I do know is ACC Nicholson is highly experienced in that area of work, and various others, but he's been a senior detective for many, many years, and he may have had oversight of the resource at Gartcosh, where the CT resource is. So I'm not surprised that he may have raised that and asked for some, I'm guessing, intelligence checks or whatever to have been done. But to be honest with you, I genuinely can't remember much more than that.
Were you aware of anything either in the factual situation that you've been advised of or any other circumstances that would give rise to considerations of counter-terrorism?
No, there was never anything raised to me at any point that this was a terrorist-related incident, no.
And when you say nothing ever, do you mean at all there was nothing ever raised that gave you cause to think it might relate to terrorism?
It never even, in my presence, been discussed as a possible hypothesis, if that's what you're suggesting.
Well, I'm just asking you if there was anything that anyone said anything to you that day or anything you were aware of
No.
that would make you think this has possibly got something to
No,
do with terrorism?
absolutely not. No.
We have heard other evidence from officers saying they didn't think there was anything to do with terrorism.
No.
No. But did ACC Nicholson explain in any way at that meeting why he raised the issue?
Not that I recall.
And did Did Pat Campbell say that this was part of his investigation, or reasons why it might be included?
No, it certainly wasn't. If there was a discussion around that specifically, it was not a protracted discussion, because I can't remember it, and it wasn't of any significance.
Right. With the fact that it was raised at this meeting by the ACC, would that give people, would people think, oh, that's a very senior officer raising it, maybe that should be part of the investigation, or?
Yeah, I mean, the fact, and it's got in the bullet, that raised by ACC, I mean, the fact he's raised it and asked for it to be actioned, then, yeah, it's, you know, will have been done. There's no doubt. It would have been given the priority that he's asked for it to be given there.
So something would have been done
Yes.
about that because it's been raised by the ACC?
Yes, absolutely.
So whether or not it was part of the investigation hypotheses at the outset, once the ACC raises it at the Gold meeting, that probably will require some action to be taken.
Yeah, I'd be really surprised if NIB had not undertaken some form of review, as has been asked for there by the ACC.
Right. I'm conscious of the time now.
Yes, well, we'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.
Okay.